suppose I rang the albums. Hurrying through the stuff that Neil has kind of declared non-canon, although it did get respectfully included on this neat recent box set of Divine CDs, which brilliantly included a Juvenilia disc. I dislike rebuying stuff, but I might have tried saving up for this massive set if I'd noticed it at the time, and before I'd seen comments about disc errors. Fanfare is the first album by the Divine Comedy when that was a band name, and it was an indie band with indie band instruments. It's a fine slice of so late 80s it's the 1990s jangle indie, but fine meaning thin rather than satisfying. The instrumentation isn't the problem, just the mumble vocals of early work. They could have gone forward with this vibe and been a relevant band, but not a unique one. Neil writes this one off, but it's not quite embarrassing, though it's also not quite worth playing live. It gets better in the middle, then it ends. I'll just say it's the least worthwhile Divine Comedy album, and then you can remember it's at the bottom. Europop EP compiled with Time Watch is long enough to be included in this video, but I've not got it. It's got its impressive moments, but it's still generic indie rock. It's balanced out by the opposite of moments, tedious long bits, and considering what he went on to make, it's kind of wasted time. It's funny how the title tracks got upcycled into far better works, but if anything, they're kind of pastiches of these indie songs, like him covering The Breeders. And of course, I heard those first, so these ones come across as indie pastiches of better songs. At least the song called Jerusalem isn't that one, but it ain't loads better. Hints of his genius are here, but they kind of just mismatch with the material. Maybe I'm breaking a rule by just excluding this from the rank, but you can pretend it's there if you like, again at the bottom. Winding back real far, the remnants of this teenage band and his home demos actually outclasses anything I've mentioned so far, managing some of that elegance and romance he later mastered. It's worth taking seriously. There's more Ireland in this. Neil hadn't yet compromised himself to be in a band with what bands ought to sound like. There's a few extra thingy CDs for this band or man, and I'm just gonna skip them as their quality is obvious in their nature. But let's get on to the actual Nelia. His debut album, as he'll call it, sets the scene for canonical Divine Comedy. So it's becoming baroque pop, at a time when that wasn't really a reference. There's a couple of tracks that you'll recognize from the earlier stuff if you were brave enough for the earlier stuff, or maybe you won't recognize them because they're completely recontextualized. Kind of subverts the bland indie they once were, or maybe just throws out the bland indie they once were. Finds the beautiful or clever song inside. Beautiful and clever are the two ways he goes. This career involves a lot of finding a balance between whimsy and elegance. And honestly, not always finding that balance. But here it's already perfected on a diversely creative suite. It even gets dark and leery toward the end, something that Neil didn't much keep in his palette, but he really has a commanding grasp of. This is a lovely gem of a book-smart pop album and kind of a centerpiece for the rest of the career, the long career to build around. One way to build around that is kind of the same but more conceptual, a bit more silly, but also serious in its silliness and silly in its seriousness. I feel that Neil is someone for whom wit is just a part of sincerity. It's just right at the core of him, and thereby he can deliver both at once in one piece. He's reached his first absolutely perfect song in the tear-jerking closer track, but the odd and fragmented adventure along the way doesn't quite stack up to the prior album's just barrage of great pop songs. Then the chamber expands. There's at least room for a four-poster in here, and probably for the better considering how prurient this one is. The vaster sound lines up nicely with the more confident and rightly so songwriter, who's still delivering on this epic creative hat trick, and just delivering hit after hit of the best of what we already know he can do, such as another tear-jerking finale song, and plenty of stuff we didn't yet know he could do. He's bloomed from shy to suave. This manages to communicate a lot of sticky material in a way that just makes it beautiful. Then you get self-consciously modest and directly make a short album and call it a short album, and do your best to assure us that the horniness is underpinned by love. We did already know that. This one's kind of buoyed by its first 2 tracks, and then the rest of them are kind of B-side level, just somewhat rote songwriting. It's intentionally slight as a product, but it feels like more effort could have been put in. It's the first time he's struck below par since establishing a very high par. Wait, is below par? Below par is good. This is whatever the bad side of par is. Then we reach the last one of the century. I might have a bias against 10-track albums. They just feel kind of minimal in what they're offering. I know I'm saying that after a 7-track album. It's kind of funny that among this discography, this one counts as unremarkable, because moment by moment, it's thoroughly remarkable. Throughout this career, there's intricate detail in the orchestral arrangements. It's just a beauty to listen to every time. That's what's come to mind for me on this one, but it's true throughout. The first and last track here are particularly great. It's just the first time chronologically with the standard set so high that it can feel like just another album. Here's the flaw of sequential ranking. I've made this one sound bad by comparing it to prior stuff. No, far from it. There's a kind of vibe that something needs to change. Neil and everyone working with him and all the reviews of this album will mention how much different it is. Coming back to guitar as a central instrument, to the template of rock music, but a very sedate interpretation of rock music. Other than the epic Bad Ambassador, which does just sound like the rest of Divine Comedy, you'll go through this album and think, well, the next track's gotta have a bit more of a pulse to it, and it doesn't. It's definitely an inversion of some of the established properties of the Divine Comedy, like how much he was imitating Radiohead on previous albums was 0%, so now it's 100%. The imitation goes as far as vocal vibrato, melody, and strumming, but not much of what's cool about Radiohead. It seats it closely to that kind of Coldplay, Travis, uncompelling coma music that cursed the turn of the ooies, but with a compelling person writing it. Neil is very canny at this vibe, and he's found some of his best songwriting on this album, but it's just expressed in this dreary way. This is worth occasional listens on a lazy Sunday, but its songs are worth more interested sounding interpretations, because they're interesting songs, just not expressed well. This is the furthest he's strayed away from silliness into sincere expression for an album, and the songs justify it, but the delivery doesn't. Absent Friends kind of chickens out of the new direction while still keeping its dullness. This sadly leaves it with only a few worthwhile tracks, incidentally the ones that actually feel like they're alive. But they're very worthwhile tracks, and with nothing that stinks, it's good enough to keep around. We then return to the fin de siècle approach, where whimsy is like the headlining act, but it sneaks beauty in under its coat. In the 90s, I referred to that being just another album as a relatively bad thing, but now he's relearned how to do just another album, and it's refreshing. It's a creative array of Neil's then latest songwriting, and it's blessed with the maturity of no longer really feeling that it's possible but you'll get a hit. Just having the faithfuls to satisfy, and this satisfies and it impresses. It's worth the argument that that's what the true lasting regeneration was, from the guy trying to make pop to communicate with people to the guy with an established audience there to enjoy his fop pop bops. A Lady of a Certain Age might be his very best song, but I don't have to commit to that opinion on an episode of Rank the Albums. With Victory, we're back on track. It's a reassuring resume to resume their career. Now to explain the plus in the video title. Okay, curveball. This collaboration is one of those ideas that seemed brilliant in the pub, and then somehow actually is brilliant in its execution. How did they manage that? It's a cosplay band, it's a concept album about sport, and one of the worst sports. Even by sports standards, it's a bad sport. But Neil and Thomas see some exhilarating fun and elegance in cricket, and they manage to communicate that to the listener. I'm almost a believer until I remember it's cricket. It's not nearly as frivolous as the idea sounds. In this collaboration, they've found a kind of ELO pop sensibility that's very welcome. This is just as fun to listen to as it would have been to make, but it can even make you stop and think a bit. About cricket. I think budgetary constraints direct this career a lot, and that's brought Neil to a very piano-songwritery based album. Here he goes nearly all in on cheeky japes. It's a music hall vibe. And that flatters him, and he's earned it. It just loses its way a bit toward the end with the frivolity and the loviness. It's a very good album in itself, but you can also sense a bit of a warning of a decline in songwriting quality. Then when your odd in-joke is well received, you do it again, but without the freshness. It feels like the first time around that you decide to make a concept album about cricket, it flows, and then when you decide that this demand for another concept album about cricket, you force it. I don't know, is that a relatable experience? We'll have to ask people who've done 2 concept albums about cricket. Pugwash's voice is foregrounded more, and it's more suited to harmonies, really. There's too many tracks that just feel scrapped together around the catchphrase title. It's basically a short but overlong set of B-sides to that album that actually worked. Then, Lovey has now reached the status of Dovey. I mean, massive kudos for being so ridiculously in love with someone 5 years later, but the soppy tone of this has soaked through to sog up the songwriting. It's not necessarily embarrassing, I could still respect it if it wasn't boring. There's 3 worthwhile tracks on here, and they don't necessarily have much in common. There's a vast and elegant bath of a ballad to soak in, a silly and cute, if forgettable, single, and a kind of spy-themed pastiche that shows more life than the entire rest of the album, but just doesn't last that long. It's kind of telling when he throws in a voice note demo as a song, generating generic love-struck rhymes before giving up on the song that wasn't worth finishing writing. Neither were the other ones. I wouldn't keep this in my collection if it weren't bundled with this tender and lovely suite. An album's length of original material in its own right. Its format being closer to a radio play than an album does mean it can't be put on quite as much, but it shows where Neil had squirreled away his brilliance at the time into bonus disc extra tracks. It's funny what we define as an album, because the next one also has an album-length bonus disc. This is more definitively demos, that's not quite as finished a product as in May. Maybe this doesn't count as the Divine Comedy, the pop career. It's commission work by composer Neil Hannon, and that's probably how he intended it. But it is a bonus disc with a Divine Comedy album. The habit of throwing in a completely distinct bonus album with each headline product is sweet. It's like the support act at a gig. You get what you go for, and you get a fresh surprise too. It's great to see a musician getting commission work. Imagine that, getting paid to make music. And yeah, maybe that brings into question the definition of an album, but while I'm here, let's get the one remaining one. If you count Duckworth 2, that's been 2 in a row that I'm not that fond of, so I was a bit apprehensive when it came to this one, like maybe I just wasn't in tune with what Neil wanted to make now, and I can respect that distance. But then he made his best album of this millennium. By committing to this theme of middle-class gripes and pouts and romance and just the state of the nation, pretty fucked up nation, Neil's really revived his insight, and he's also brought some electrics to his light orchestra approach. His longest album, it's overflowing with ideas showing that he's still got it in him and more. It's ready to get odd in new ways, to pastiche things he's not yet pastiched, and just great timing. 2019 was literally the last year you could write something relatable about people working in an office. His quirks have found a great home in this concept. He just smashes it throughout. I obviously, if never quite consciously, owe a lot to the Divine Comedy, at least in my singing voice. I don't think I quite reached the intricacy of his songwriting, but I'll do my best to try. I really admire his approach to pop, where pop is the intention. He loves pop and he wants to make pop, but with no qualms in being intellectual about it. Why qualm your intellect? It's an asset.